Good morning, it's Mark Bernard from the Bernard Institute for Cybersecurity, and I'm here today to talk about the General Data Protection Regulation. There's been a lot of confusion around the GDPR, as it's affectionately known, and of course it is an all-reaching privacy legislation designed to protect the information of Europeans, but it's having influence, of course, in many other countries who trade or provide services to the European Union because they also have to comply. So today I'd like to spend a little bit of time and offer an option or some thoughts on how you might be able to go about complying with the GDPR and making it doable ultimately. So on today's agenda, it's going to be action-packed. There's a lot of information to share here on how privacy might work within an organization in conjunction with cybersecurity or other information security practices, such as the annual financial CFO certification. We're going to talk about the attack vectors of cybersecurity. We're going to talk about 10 layers of architecture. Cybersecurity architecture is also a very gray area that a lot of organizations have no idea what that actually means, although it's mentioned many times in several pieces of legislation, and certainly the NIST cybersecurity framework hasn't actually come out and said the word architecture yet, but it has implied it. So, and of course there's a lot of talk about zero trust and a number of other frameworks that are kind of going down the same path. So I'm going to share the 10 layers with you. Enterprise risk management, very important because for many, many years, for decades in fact, information security and IT have struggled with how do we articulate what our needs are to the ERM, which is what the executive and the board of directors tend to focus on. I have some GDPR analysis, so I'm going to give you a quick rundown. I've gone through the 99 different articles and my take on where these are pointing. GDPR compliance summary, so I've summarized those to give you kind of an overall ballpark estimate of how much time or emphasis you should spend on each of these areas. We're going to talk about information protection governance, which is very important to all information protection regulations and statutes. Cybersecurity, we're going to talk about the financial and the PII, which is an acronym for personally identifiable information. You'll see that down here on my screen. Actually, let me move my image. Okay, so right down here you'll see there are some acronyms, and they've been defined down here. So GDPR, General Data Protection Regulation; PII, personally identifiable information; IH, information handling; and RBAC, role-based access control. Okay, so here we're going to talk about the obligations or the legal requirements for a number of different statutes. We're going to talk about some decision points around information handling. Decision point workflow. So daily operations versus maintaining an RBAC or a classification schema. The RBAC design, how we plan on implementing RBAC, which is very important because access control, identity, and access management is kind of the cornerstone of how we provide access to information or prevent the misuse of information. Information handling classification, the PII security standards. So we're going to talk about some security requirements that need to go into the GDPR that need to be integrated into your infrastructure and how you handle information. Supply chain legal obligation flow down is very important. Cybersecurity, GDPR enterprise management system. So how can we take all of this, all these legal requirements and bundle them into something that we can call a program and operationalize it to make it streamlined, make it fit into our organization and what we do today. We're going to talk about shadow cybersecurity versus GDPR compliance. So that's an interesting topic. We've been talking about shadow IT for a while. In case you're not up to speed on what that means, it means basically you have an IT group who's been mandated the responsibility of providing like cloud services or infrastructure services, laptops, servers, networking, that type of stuff. But now with the new requirements coming out from GDPR, we see other groups creating their own IT infrastructure in order to support GDPR. So we want to clarify that because they're definitely, the focus is different between the two, although there are a lot of people confusing them together. And then finally, a conclusion and some suggestions on what the next steps are. Okay? Cybersecurity knows no boundaries. Oh, how true is that? Well, I'm your presenter today, and I've been doing cybersecurity, working in this profession for over 20 years. During my career, I've reported directly to corporate presidents, chief executive officers, chief operations officers, senior VPs and directors, government deputy ministers, and executive directors. So I've worked with the engineers at the systems level and the business analysts at the business level, but almost always, most of my career has been spent communicating with the higher level of management teams. In fact, my first 7 years in IT, I reported directly to a senior vice president who had over 25 years of experience, and he was a great mentor to me early in my career. I've led enterprise security programs for Fortune 50 banking for Morgan Stanley, 130 direct reports, covering a number of projects, including e-fraud, CERT, iResponse, insider threat, and security architecture. I've led projects with health authorities, also with Unicorn, U.S. Federal Cloud Service, VirtuStream in Washington, D.C. That was a great project. What a great team, and so proud of everything they've accomplished there. Awesome. Also with nanotechnology, very cool, up and coming. It's going to be 600 million jobs in the world available in nanotech. We're doing nanotech now, but a lot of people don't talk about it much, but it will be coming mainstream because it has major health implications, but also military implications. I've worked with pharmaceuticals, probably one of the more heavily regulated industries because they produce human consumable products, so they need to be traceable. Everything they do is traceable forward and backward from their supply chain out to the pharmaceuticals that sell the products to the labs that manufacture them. So I've worked on that whole chain. Legal firms, I've helped lawyers secure information for their clients. Manufacturing, a number of different areas. So food manufacturing, another supply chain challenge. Also technology manufacturing, and also apparel. So that was kind of a fun one. Telecom service providers, so some big ones. Telecoms do things differently than everyone else. They've been on the forefront of the internet service since day one. And so telecoms have a different viewpoint than most other organizations. Financial service providers, insurance companies, and banks. The organizations I've worked for have had as few as eight employees and as many as 150,000. So I'm thinking of some of the big ones like IBM and EDIS Advanced Solutions, very large, lots of people. Also NTT Data is growing, and then some very small ones. These organizations are both global. So I work with global organizations in the US, Canada, South America, Europe, Asia, and Africa. And I've also worked on national projects. So we have some of my customers operate across the US or across Canada. Some of them are more regional. Some are in the East or the West. And then we have local businesses who are very specific to their geography. So for instance, the city of Toronto. Okay. Something unique about what I do, because I am sort of a lone wolf out there. I am an independent cybersecurity contractor with deep technical skills. My first 10 years I spent systems engineering, network engineering, and software engineering. And I did that because I was basically a one-person shop supporting a number of users, like over 50 users, within a HRIS environment and a payroll. I also had to manage the subledger, so I had to learn a lot about accounting and take accounting lessons. And I've taken all of those skills and kind of blended them together into my approach on cybersecurity, which has helped me a lot to accomplish things that other people can't. I do not have a monthly revenue or sales quotas, so that means there's no pressure from the board of directors on me or anybody else. So I don't have to generate work, to create work in order to meet sales quotas. So what I do is I do what you need, or what my customers need, and that's all I do. And I help them solve problems, and I don't try and take the longest route to the problem so that I can generate more revenue from them, like some organizations who compete against me. Also, my opinion is remained highly objective. I am an auditor. I'm a ISO 27000 auditor, also a CISA, a certified information systems auditor. I don't have any hidden relationships with anybody, any third parties. So that means that I don't have to sell their products. I don't have to push their products on my customers. And I can remain objective and opinionated about the service that they provide and the products they provide. I've solved many cybersecurity problems that have saved millions of dollars. True, can be proven easily. Also prevented reputational damage with government ministries and commercial enterprises, such as breaches and stuff like that. I've helped to solve. I've helped extend existing contracts and close new deals. That's part of the role of a leader in the cybersecurity world. If you're a CISO or if you're a chief cybersecurity officer, this is what you do. You help your organization, you protect it, you protect the information that's been entrusted to it, and you help it grow. I've helped many executives. They've given me very generous bonuses because of my work, and also extended contracts. And of course, a lot of them are repeat customers, which is the best in my business. And of course, I continue to take on new challenges all the time. Cybersecurity knows no boundaries. Okay, let's talk about the cybersecurity threat attack vectors. So did you know that there's over 8 billion connected devices? Internet of Things is growing rapidly. Did you know that there's 763 operating systems? I didn't know that until I went to work in the pharmaceutical business, and then I realized that some of the manufacturing equipment that's built and protected for many generations behind secure, hard exteriors run very dilapidated, if you like, or low-level operating systems. None of them have vulnerability management. None of them do patching. They're wide open to attack if anyone can infiltrate the organization. And we're seeing this, of course, in the energy sector. A lot of the systems, mechanical systems that are behind the walls of the brick and mortar were once protected, but now because of so many different avenues to infiltrate or to access the interior of the hardened infrastructure, these things are becoming exposed, and they're extremely vulnerable. So 763 operating systems. We know about a few. We use Windows, we use Linux, we use IBM OS systems. There's a number of systems that we use, Unix, that we're familiar with, but there are many, many, many more. 51% of malware cannot be detected. And this has been proven through several honeypot projects, and a number of organizations do this on a regular basis. They set up devices out on the internet. They give them different types of configurations. Some are loaded with Linux, some with Windows. Some of them have McAfee, some of them have Symantec. They have different configurations, and then they allow people to attack them on the internet, and then we gather intelligence from that. And this is how we know that 51% of them are totally exposed. They can't see. They can't detect what they don't know about. 49%, of course, can be detected. So that's the good side. So it's a kind of a 50-50. Your glass is half full, or is it half empty? 80% of exploits that are published go undetected. So exploit code is interesting. There's some popular tools out there to generate exploit code where you can download exploits. But in my day, when I worked on the IBM Red team for 2 years, we used to create our own exploit code. We didn't really pay much attention to the vulnerabilities that were being published or anything. But what we did do is we were experts on different architectures and operating systems, and we knew our way around those systems because if you study them closely enough, you'll find there are many cracks. And 20% can be detected. 20% can be detected. So that's the good news. So it's a flip side. Again, this is not a 50-50, however. the glass is not half full and half empty. It's mostly empty. So exploits can penetrate most infrastructures. 60% of malware viruses. 60% of malware are viruses. Okay. So what that means is that so the things that the antivirus can detect are known. So if you go to the Common Vulnerability Database, you can see that there's a list of items there. A lot of those things can be detected. There's also other ways of detecting anomalies, if you like, within the environment. But 60% can be detected. And this kind of goes along with the whole notion that a lot of exploits are undetected. Well, the reason why is because they're using different vulnerabilities within systems that might be unpublished, like 0 days, and accessing environments. 1% are rootkits. So rootkits are really nasty because the only way to fix a system with a rootkit is sometimes you have to replace it completely. It's hard to move. It gets wrapped around the microcode at the lowest level of the system, around the chip sometimes, and it's very difficult to remove and sometimes impossible. 29% are Trojans. Now, that's really important to understand because Trojans are how ransomware gets executed, for instance. So it often starts with a phishing scam. Someone gets an email, there's a link on it, they click on the link, next thing you know, they're downloading the Trojan. So once the threat gets the Trojan loaded onto your system, then they can go to work on the ransomware part of it. So 29% of malware are Trojans. And 10% are worms. Now, worms are very nasty. Some of them are intelligent. Some of them go back. They reach back to the Common Vulnerability Database or another source to identify what the vulnerabilities are with a particular system once they've done a scan, once they get inside of an organization. Some of them are very serious. Worms are very serious. You probably heard of the Stuxnet. The Stuxnet worm almost created a nuclear incident where it got inside of an organization, and basically its approach was to attack the cooling system that kept the rods cool inside the reactor, and it pushed the limit of those cooling systems to extreme level where they failed. So they knew what the failure point was, and they pushed those cooling systems until they stopped working. And once they stopped working, then the rods continued to heat and they weren't being cooled. And some of them actually melted down. So it was very close to a very serious accident. Thank God nothing happened. So these are the threat attack vectors. Very interesting. There's lots of different angles to get into an organization that can't be stopped. So you need to have a good defense in depth approach. And that brings us to an important point, the 10 layers of defense in depth. So what does that look like? Now I did this, reviewed this with my colleague, Michael Dong. He's a good friend of mine, and we had some good discussions about what this might look like, and here's what we've come up with. So layer 1, we have the edge firewall. This is the firewall that sits out on the perimeter. We also have physical security on the outermost perimeter. We have CCTV, key lock, we have barriers, and we have environmental security, all happening on the first layer of cybersecurity architecture. Then we have a DMZ, so a demilitarized zone. We may have reverse proxy set up in the DMZ. Reverse proxy helps defend against that DDoS attack. Some of the attacks that we've been seeing are hitting very high levels of, of traffic, attempting to bring down a system. The reverse proxy helps to deflect the DDoS away from the organization. So it's a very important thing to have here. The DMZ is a place where we might have transaction servers. There's a lot of things that can go on in the DMZ, but basically it's a lower level of security than the infrastructure. But it's important that we have, if you're a CISSP, a Certified Information System Security Professional, you know we have to have 2 layers before we get to the infrastructure. We have to have 2 firewalls. So we have the edge firewall, and then we have the interior firewall. And in here we have things set up like natting, which helps us to to change the IP addresses. So if an external threat is trying to access a specific IP, guess what? We've changed it. It's like changing your postal code or your zip code. If you want to prevent someone from using your IP to attack you, natting is a good way to do that. We also have a network intrusion prevention system. So this is a real live-time system that feeds data usually into a security information and event management system, which may have a security operations team monitoring it. It also has a lot of intelligence built into it, so it can automatically block things. Anything it's suspicious of that it can't decrypt and inspect, it will block it and send a flag to the operators or the security analysts to review and investigate. We have security zones set up here, so we try to segregate different parts of the organization. So we have built another layer between this firewall, the other firewall, the DMZ, and then we have another sort of a subnetwork, if you like, or a zone. We call it a security zone. We also have network access control, and this is an important device. Not all organizations have this, but it is very useful, and basically allows you to register the devices that are authorized to access your network. And anyone that's not authorized won't be able to connect to your network. So, pardon me, network access control. And we also have the VPN server sitting back here. So you can put the VPN server in a number of different locations, but this is probably the best. And the VPN server allows a secure tunnel to be created. So on a device, a laptop or a mobility device that's working out in the field from home or from another location, from a customer's location, they have a security key on that device. We also have a security key on this side of the interior firewall. And when they connect, they build a secure tunnel across the internet to protect people from eavesdropping or sniffing your traffic or what have you. So that's layer 3. Layer 4, we have switching, MPLs and load balancers, DNS and VLANs. So these are, again, more devices that are used to control the flow of packets across our network, or perhaps across the WAN that we have. They also control the volume of traffic, so load balancers can level out the traffic, so you don't have one device being hammered. You can even it out. DNS helps to connect names to IP addresses, and VLANs are very similar to security zones. Again, it allows us to do more segregation. And when we create a security zone or a VLAN, we can add another layer of access control. So that's multiple layers of access control. When we talk about RBAC, you'll get to see kind of what we're talking about there. Layer 5, access control and identity and access management. Some people might think that when you log onto a website that you're already inside the network, right? But actually, as you can see, layer 1, 2, 3, and 4, there's a number of layers that actually occur before you do enter your credentials and log into that. You don't see them as a user, but this is what the security team and your IT or ICT team are working hard at, are designing these networks, building them, and so that they can protect you and protect the company's information. Access control is layer 5, and identity and access management. Now, they may also, identity and access management is an interesting thing. It's being built into more firewalls. So firewalls are beginning to detect people and identify who people are coming into the network. So they can work closely with access management, and it's possible that you can use access management to block them at the firewall if they're not authorized. Layer 6, anti-malware. So this is what sits on your device. It could sit on a server too. Scans, looks for those known threats, so the 60%. We have to use many layers in order to deter any type of threat agent. So every layer helps. Even if it's only 60% effective, it still does a job. Endpoint protection is very important too. We have a lot of really cool tools out there that get loaded on our endpoints, on our mobile devices, our smart devices, laptops and tablets. Anything that's sitting outside of that edge firewall, we want to be able to protect. Endpoint protection helps us do that. It tracks any type of access to your device to see if it's authorized or not. Peripheral security includes a number of other devices. So we're talking about maybe some smart devices such as multi-function printers that do scanning, copying, and they have hard drives. They record information. A lot of them have access to the internet for maintenance purposes. So those devices also need to have some access control built into it. I know HP, I worked on a project with them. I wrote a paper for them a few years ago about how they're taking basically access control from a typical access control system, and now they're installing it on their multifunction devices so that they can provide the same type of layers that we're talking about here in order to protect the information on those systems. So that's very helpful. Mobile security, again, using encryption on devices to protect the information on them, making sure that they're authenticating properly to the organization. The Internet of Things is coming. It's here. There's a lot of smart devices. We have light bulbs, all kinds of things, thermostats, sensors, everywhere. It's growing and growing and growing. And then we have what we call the EIPS. So this is the endpoint intrusion prevention system. So a lot of these new tools, such as the Microsoft ATP tool, will actually send information to other systems that help protect. So we have sort of a security fabric, if you can imagine. You're imagining the knights of, the old day that used to wear the chainmail underneath their armor to prevent arrows from piercing into them. The EIPS is kind of like that. So it's a bit of the fabric around our devices that helps us to feed intelligence into other devices that take different types of action. So blocking and reporting and sharing intelligence with other organizations. Very important. It's layer 6. Layer 7, we have DLP, data loss prevention, SIM, which is a security information event management system, and we have intelligence sharing. And intelligence sharing is the third pillar, if you like, in the NIST cybersecurity framework. Intelligence sharing among authorized people, very important in order to prevent attacks against our networks and systems. Security information event management system is the software that a security operations team uses to monitor your organization, whether it's a government organization or whether it's a commercial sector organization. It's a very useful tool. I've designed several SIEMs that report on everything. We can correlate information from many different systems. We can also build custom rules with the SIEM that will help your organization because maybe you're in a unique part of industry where you don't have a lot of, predefined attacks, vectors or signatures. So we might create our own. Maybe you have some unique assets that you want to protect that aren't included in a typical SIM package or IPS package or an ATP package. So it's possible with the SIM to record, to build special alerts so that you can alert your security operations team and the security analysts to do their investigation and prevent these attacks from destroying data or disrupting your service. And data loss prevention, of course, is about monitoring for the insider threat. So we want to make sure that people, and it's a very small amount of people, aren't taking assets away from the organization or creating any sort of mayhem, but mostly about removing information, assets that have value to the organization. If a person is leaving, they know they're leaving. They have a new job with a competitor, for instance. They might try and take a list of the customers that we have, which is very dangerous for the organization. So we want to be able to catch those people. It's not a lot of people that try this sort of thing, and we're talking about 1 or 2%, but it's still, you only need one person. As Morgan Stanley found out, they had a trader walk off the floor with a Rolodex of their customers, and it cost them $8 million. So after that, they built a massive cybersecurity team of 1,400. I was a leader. I had 130 direct reports on that with the 5 teams I mentioned before. And they're still operating. It's an awesome team. They do fabulous work. So that's layer 7. Layer 8, cybersecurity management system. So this is so we talked a lot about technology being built into the layers, but how do you manage all this technology? You need a plan, you need a program, and it's going to have governance and risk management and continual improvement. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. ITIL is important, information technology information layer. ITIL is the best approach that I've seen, the best standard for ICT or for IT or for IMIT. If you don't have procedures and standards or policies around things like change management or configuration management or incident or problem management, ITIL is a great place to start. Privacy impact assessments need to be done. We're talking about GDPR and how it fits into the ERM. And so certainly doing a privacy impact assessment is one of the things you do up front. I've done those for the government and had them signed off by deputy ministers. So I know the quality of the PIA is very important. How you do it and present it is very important. It is a compliance tool. It's to make sure that you're following the regulation. The security threat risk assessment is very important as well. It helps to flesh out what are the vulnerabilities and threats to your devices and helps you to prioritize by creating a risk rating so that you can calculate it. And then there's other frameworks like the grandfather of all information security frameworks in cybersecurity, ISO 27001. Been working with that personally for over 20 years. The NIST cybersecurity framework I've been working with since 2014 when it first got published. It's good. It requires a high level of maturity in order to get implemented, but its focus is very unique. And risk management is one of the key things you need to do to integrate an appropriate NIST framework. And then we have other standards like SOC 2. And so we're going to talk more about the compliance and how these all relate to each other in a few slides. And then layer 9, cloud 9, same thing. Cloud computing is another layer. So my approach is that you have to have layers 1 to 8 in place in order to access the cloud instance. A lot of people assume that because you put it out in the cloud that things are vulnerable. That's not true, actually. There's a lot of work that goes in front of your cloud instance that people don't see. And that's unfortunate. So cloud's got a bit of a bad reputation, but certainly everything is going to the cloud because the cloud is reducing the footprint of the ICT IT organization. We don't need more technicians to manage servers because the servers are in the clouds. Somebody else manages the platform and the server, and we just manage it from the operating system up. So cloud computing is part of your defense in depth. It definitely helps. One of the trends I see in the US a lot is that the concept of disaster recovery is kind of going away. And that budget that was used for DRP is now being applied to cloud computing because if you have multiple instances around the planet of your data and your organization, then it's possible for you to immediately fail over to another instance if you lose one. So DRP doesn't really matter if you have another team in another part of the world that can pick up the work if there is a disaster, if there's an earthquake, flooding, or fire, or what have you, volcanic activity. You can always fail over to another part of the world where it's not happening and have that team pick up that slack. So cloud computing is actually part of our layers of defense in depth. And finally, 10. So if all else fails, we do have business continuity and DRP. And I know I was talking about how cloud computing is taken away from that. Well, hopefully by the time you get to layer 9, you don't have any issues. You've been able to provide enough diligence in front of your organization and services and data that you don't have to worry about having a DRP incident. However, service continuity is important. That's really the thing that's coming up and taking place, of DRP, making sure that our services are always available, testing that process out, having plans. This is all well integrated into the NIST cybersecurity framework. It talks a lot about identification and recovery, identification, responding, and then recovery. And the recovery part leans a lot on the traditional concepts of DRP with a slight twist to it. So we won't actually talk too much about that today, but I have a NIST cybersecurity training course. If you want to find out more about that, you might want to sign up for that at my website. Okay, so these are the various layers of defense in depth. This is the management system: governance, risk management, incident management, continual improvement, strategic communications, awareness training, internal, external audit, and record and document administration. So that's the management system, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later on. Okay, the risk universe. So here's how I map out the risk universe. So I have a backbone. Let's draw a straight line with an arrow, and we're going to put your product and service at one end of it. So what is it that you deliver? What's the mission of your organization? Okay? Now, in the risk universe, and this is based on the COSO Enterprise Risk Management Framework, we have 5 key areas. So we have financial risks, strategic risks, hazard risk, compliance risk, and operational risk. Okay? And traditionally, your cybersecurity and information security has addressed any sort of operational risk and maybe some hazard risk too. Because when we talk about things like disaster recovery, we're talking about protecting humans. We may have built security mechanisms into our security program. We may have guards. We may have a front desk. We may have man traps. We might have CCTV that's monitoring people and access control cards to make sure authorized people get in. There's a lot of things that we can do to help guard against hazard risks. So both natural and unnatural or nature-based. So human-based versus nature-based, yes. Strategic risk and financial risk, we're seeing more and more of these being impacted by cybersecurity because of the breaches and ransomware. This is affecting our profile, our reputation, which affects our strategic plans for the future. Some organizations have gone Chapter 11, so their strategic future has been wiped out. Some of them have sold for less money. There's a lot of things around strategy that cybersecurity and GDPR and information security can help guard against. That includes financial risk. So, for instance, ransomware, most obvious threat. If you get hit with a ransomware attack and you don't have a good backup and you haven't changed your environment to protect against ransomware, then you're going to pay money. And that money is going to come from somewhere. So it's going to come from Treasury, probably. Probably not in your budget. If you have cybersecurity insurance, it will cover up to a certain level. And hopefully your ransomware is within that level. But if it's not, then you're going to pay. For instance, the Equifax breach that cost them so far $750 million. So not too many organizations, definitely not mom and pops, could reach into the treasury and pull out $750 million and fix a problem. The same with Morgan Stanley. Creating a team of information risk or cybersecurity people that's 1,400 people in total is a massive investment by the organization, but they are the number one bank in the world. They're Fortune 50, one of the only Fortune 50s banks. And so they can invest in that type of stuff. But for a small organization, they have no hope. They can't do that. So you definitely need to consider the more that we know, the more that we move forward, strategic risk and financial risk are being drawn more into scope, and the dots are being connected between operational risk and strategic and financial risk. Compliance risk is all about protecting the organization, making sure that we're following the laws and regulations. And this is a clear delineation here now between GDPR on one hand and cybersecurity on the other. And we're going to talk about shadow cybersecurity teams near the end of this presentation. But one of the important things to note here is that GDPR is a regulation. It's a law, right, that we have to follow. And so we need to treat it like compliance risk. GDPR has implications for operational risk. However, operational risk, there needs to be a clear segregation of duties between the two. And unfortunately, I'm seeing a lot of organizations that are blending the two. And this is creating a lot of confusion and a lot of disruption a lot of duplication, not leveraging the best knowledge of the organization for the best purposes, creating some contention for resources and for budgets. There's a lot of problems with taking that approach. So definitely, GDPR needs to be treated like compliance risk, because that's what it is. And cybersecurity and information security needs to address the operational risk. And they both need to work hand in hand, because they both have codependencies. So we'll talk about more about that too. The risk universe. So you'll see a number of bubbles that I have here. We're going to explain those. The yellow bubble, number one, these are all different assets that are required to deliver financial services that can create risk. So we have number one, people, or number one, information rather, number two, people, number three, software, four, hardware, five, telecommunications, and six, facilities. All of these different types of assets have some kind of vulnerabilities associated with them that need to be managed as part of the risk management process. And financial risk, strategic risk, hazard risk, compliance risk, operational risk, they all have the same. So there's 6 key assets that need to be managed. The good news is that when you manage the risks associated with people, for instance, for one group, it might actually improve the quality of security or resilience, if you like, for all the other people assets that you have in the organization. Unless there's a group that has a higher level, that they're protecting a very sensitive or restricted piece of information, their security requirements might be a level higher. So for instance, you look at government classification for roles. So you have enhanced reliability, you have top secret, you have different types of roles with different types of classification. And it's based on the information that they have access to. That's why. Okay, so you have different assets. And then we also have suppliers. And those suppliers also have the same assets. But the thing is that suppliers are kind of outside of the reach of us. So we have an agreement with them. We have a contract. We need to have a flow down clause in order to make sure that they're following our GDPR obligations. Okay, and we have suppliers all over the place. This is part of our risk universe. As we deliver products or services, here are the risks that are involved. And this is the key at the bottom for your reference. Let me move my little image here. There we go. So you can see people, information, software, hardware, telecommunications, and facilities. And the reason why they're grouped like this is because, again, when you talk about the vulnerabilities and the threats to those vulnerabilities and the exposures to people, if you fix it for one group of people, assets, you might fix it for all of them. And the same with information applies. So information has unique type of vulnerabilities that people don't have, for instance, or software doesn't have. So if we treat the vulnerabilities and the risks around these different assets in this manner, we have a more efficient, effective way of doing like vulnerability management, asset management, treating risks with a risk treatment plan. This is a really important, streamlined approach that I've developed on my own over the many decades of experience. Okay, so here's some examples of the type of threats that we talk about when we talk about ERM. So operational risk, for example, could be human error, could be accidents. Somebody does something unintentionally. We had a telecommunication outage in Toronto once where one of the bell guys was working in one of the main switches downtown, and he dropped his wrench and it fell right into a bunch of circuits, and 911, all the phones were down for many hours in Toronto. That was a long time ago, but it was a serious matter. So human error or accidents sometimes happen. And then, of course, there's malicious threats. So we talk about the insider threat a lot. And there are some people that actually do want to harm our organization. They might be former employees disgruntled because of the treatment that they had, or they felt that how they were treated was bad. So human resources and the hiring managers have a big job to do whenever they exit somebody. And it can't be taken lightly. How we treat people is very important to the success of the organization, whether they're with us, working with us, or whether they're leaving, both. Two, compliance risk. So the executive team has fiduciary responsibilities. So I don't know if you know this, but a director and above can be fined or can be taken to court and put in jail if there's a problem. Many of the breaches that have happened over the last 10 years, the CEO has been automatically fired. Just like that, right? So the board of directors said, it's your fault. You know everything that's going on in your organization. You're fired. And if you look back at Conrad Black's case, for instance, when he was tried in the U.S., wasn't related to a breach. However, it's an example of how high we hold executive officers, chief executive officers. The judge instructed him, his defense was that he didn't know that something was going on inside his organization, and the judge gave him the instruction known as the ostrich clause. And the ostrich clause says that if you're the CEO, you can't stick your head in the sand and pretend you don't know what's going on. You are responsible ultimately. So the executive team, the VPs, the directors, they all have a fiduciary responsibility that's related to compliance. Hazard risk. These are exposures to non-human threats and viruses. For instance, this pandemic that's going on, or acts of nature. So, there's lots of different types of threats that we're exposed to, and we need to manage the risks around those. Financial risks. A breach can lead to insolvency for some organizations. If you're small, the Equifax breach has cost them so far $750 million. It's a lot. Most organizations would be wiped out with $5 million, right? Because there's a lot of mom and pops. There's about 60 million businesses in the U.S. right now, and most of them are mom and pops. And of course, financial liquidity. If you get to a point where you've had so many ransomware attacks that you don't have a treasury anymore, you're going to have a problem. And if you can't sell your business to cover the breach, then you're going to go Chapter 11. So these are all financial types of risks. Strategic risks, missed financial goals, unrealized business benefits. So we set goals 5 years down the road where the organization wants to be, where they need to be to stay alive and grow. And also the unrealized benefits. And there may be a few of those going on now because of the pandemic. Unfortunately, a lot of businesses are not operating in a traditional sense anymore. The new traditional sense is evolving rapidly. So business benefits, of course, are the goals that we set for revenue. So if we miss revenue, we have a problem. We have unrealized business benefits, which means that if you're traded publicly, that the people who own stock in your organization are not going to be happy with your performance. And that means there will be changes. They might sell their stock. They might demand that there's a shakeup on the board of directors, or that the CEO get fired. There could be a lot of things that could happen because of missed strategic goals or unrealized business benefits. So these are just some examples of the 5. I wanted to give my colleagues in the cybersecurity and privacy space some ideas of what we're talking about here. So it's good to have examples. Okay, my GDPR analysis. So I've gone through the 99 articles, and I basically map what I think based on my experience. And I've been a privacy and security officer in government and in banking. Here in BC, British Columbia, Canada, where we have the strictest privacy laws, probably comparable to GDPR. So I've gone through the different articles, and I've just identified over on the right-hand column here what I think it would take to resolve this or to address this particular area. So in Article 1, I believe a business plan is what we need to do. Material and territorial scope, it's pretty straightforward. We need to do some scoping exercise. And definitions, we need to have some defined terms. And this is a legal thing that is important so that we're all speaking the same language, in fact, because many people may interpret a term to mean something completely different from one organization to another. So in the contract or in the agreements that we have, or in your program, if you have a glossary, you need to have defined terms so that we use those terms in any sort of legal transactions to make sure that we're all speaking the same language. Here under Article 5 through 11, I've gone through and I see policies. We need lots of new policies. Principles relating to processing of personal information. We need to document lawful process. We need to document that as a policy for our organization. Conditions of consent is a new policy. And of course, whenever you create a new policy, we're talking about awareness training, a communication strategy to raise the level of our organization. So there's going to need to be the governance committee, first of all, convened to make decisions. And then there's going to need to be some policies written, and there's going to need to be some training and awareness done. 8, conditions applicable to child's consent related to information society services. Processing of special categories of personal data, processing of personal data related to criminal convictions and offenses, processing which does not require identification. So, while I said policy is the starting point. There may be procedures and standards that go behind this, but policy is the first step in order to resolve 5 to 11. Okay. Chapter 3, rights of the data subject. So this is an interesting area in the GDPR. There's a number of, key points here. So transparency and modularities, and transparency, information communication modularities, and exercise of the rights of the subject. So these are areas that as we execute them and provide transparency is usually best handled by doing audits. So you can have an external audit or you can have an internal audit. Internal audits definitely are more focused on improving the process and making sure that the organization is protected. External audits are about providing that independent arm's length reach review of what it is that you're doing to make sure that it's on track. And an external audit or internal audit is an excellent way to provide transparency to the board of directors, to the chief executive officer, to the shareholders, to make sure that whatever it is we're doing complies with the GDPR requirements. Section 2, information and access to personal information. Information to be provided where personal data is collected from a data subject. Information to be provided where personal data has not been obtained from the data subject. These are interesting issues that have certainly come up in my experience with privacy and security. Right to access by the data subject. These are not foreign. They're very on track. And my experience is that we need to have procedures. Procedures need to help you identify where to provide information and where it can be collected and where it can be used. And there needs to be, again, awareness training for the staff that are involved so that they know what to do and they can follow the procedures. And then it needs to be reviewed and audited to make sure we have transparency. Information handling can be used to make sure that that the data that we've obtained and where it's being used and handled. Certainly when we do the privacy impact assessment, we're going to be doing some data tracking. We're going to build, a registry of our personal information holdings and signing some responsibilities and ownership around that data to make sure that there is somebody keeping an eye on it and making sure that it's protected. But generally, as an enterprise or an organization, we need to have procedures and information handling practices in place. Down here, 3, right to recidification, right to erasure, so right to be forgotten, in other words. So we need to have some procedures around this. So, generally when we ask for somebody's personal information is to conduct a certain type of transaction. And under a lot of laws like PCI, for instance, once the transaction is done, we shouldn't really be keeping that information. But we know organizations are, and this is why GDPR is coming into force, is to help manage that information. So being able to reach back out to them, Article 16, and making sure that they're still okay with us using their information on a regular basis. You probably see a lot of websites doing that now. Every once in a while you'll get a notification from them that we have your information. We want to make sure that you're okay if we continue to use it. And the right to erasure. This is a very challenging item for most ICT, IMT organizations. If we have personal information instances Erasing it from the primary transaction database is easy, but then we have backups and we have cloud instances as well to remove. So it gets very complicated, and this is a big to-do, but you need to have procedures around that in order to get it done. That's 17. 18, rights of the data subject. So again, this is about governance. It's about having procedures to protect against the restriction of processing. You might have standards as well about that. Notification obligation regarding recidification and erasure of personal information. So we need to have procedures around that. Some of those would involve communication, but they certainly involve a workflow. Right to data portability, again, procedures around that. Do we have authorization to have data transferred from one system to another, migrated or shared? And all of these are covered also in the information handling practice and procedure. Right to object and automated individual decision making. So we need to have some procedures around this. Right to object, there needs to be a policy on that. So we need the executives, policies come from the executives. They need to make a decision on how the right to object will be conducted. And then there needs to be a procedure behind that to make sure that it gets done. Automated individual decision making, including profiling. So we need to have some procedures around that. We may also have a policy on that. Restrictions are all about data classification. So section 523. Chapter 4, controlling and processing. Again, there needs to be some governance around this, around the obligations, around responsibility of the controller. The data protection and design by default is involving architecture. So we don't hear a lot of talk about architecture, but I did provide you with an example of cybersecurity architecture that could be used to protect information. This is something we've been doing in the cybersecurity world for many decades already. Joint controllers, this is talking about governance, about a group of people who might be working on the same type of information, who might have different responsibilities for that information. Representatives, controllers, and processors not established in the union. So we need to have some flow down clauses. So anybody that's outside of our organization that we don't have direct, authority over, we need to somehow build in authority into our agreements with those people. Flow down clauses are the way to go with these. So making sure that they handle that personal information that we're sharing with the same high level of regard, the standard of due care that we have as an organization. So that's very important. The only way to do that is to have flow down clauses. And flow down clauses, we take the law and we write it into a schedule and we put it into our master service agreement. So it's very straightforward. Been there, done that kind of thing, and it works. But there's a lot of procedures around here and policies, and that's why I'm going through this with you, right? Section 2, security of personal data. So we need to have standards around this. So we need to have, what type of encryption needs to be used, where is it stored, how is it transmitted, that type of stuff. Notification of personal information data breach to the supervisory authority. So we need to have a breach protocol. And in the breach protocol, it's very straightforward. It's in the unlikely event that we have a breach, what do we do? Who do we notify? What order? Who needs to be notified? Okay, who needs to be kept up to date as we investigate the significance of the breach? So this is a protocol. Data protection, impact assessment, and prior consultation. So these are all about procedures, protection, impact assessment. So we call it a privacy impact assessment, but protection assessment is fine. Prior consultation, so procedures, designation of data protection officer. So this is about the governance. Position of the data protection officer. So this is important because I can tell you, based on my cybersecurity and information security and privacy experience, the best position that I had was reporting to the Director of Internal Audit, actually, because the Director of Internal Audit reports to a subcommittee on the Board of Directors. So we had a direct line to the Board of Directors that was outside of the CEO, the CEO, and the VPs and the directors. So if there was a problem, we could bring it to the Board of Directors and they could give instructions to the CEO. And we had, of course, dotted lines to the traditional hierarchy of the organization. Codes of conduct. These are about policies and monitoring of approval of codes of conduct. This is an audit process. Certification. These are standards, certification bodies. Again, more standards. These are external groups that are going to be able to certify. So they're going to conduct audits against the standards that we have set up and determine whether or not we're following the highest level of standard that's required to protect that information. Transfer of personal information to a third party. So we need to have general principles for transfer. We need to have a policy around that. Transfers on the basis of adequacy and decision. We need to have procedures around how we make that decision. Also around transfer decisions concerning the subject to appropriate safeguards. We need to have some procedures around how we make the decisions around that. Binding corporate rules. So this is where the legal department can get involved. Certainly GDPR is not all about general counsel or legal counsel. It is a compliance requirement that we have to work with the counselors and the legal department on. But GDPR is just another compliance thing that we need to do and we need to manage carefully. And so it needs to be configured carefully. And I'll explain why legal is not really the most appropriate group to assign GDPR to near the end. Transfers of or disclosures not authorized by union law. So we need to have some procedures around how that's handled. I know from my experience with EDS, I helped design the PIA and the TRA strategy in order to migrate data, citizens' data from the government, from the Ministry of Small Business and the Ministry of Revenue, into the hands of a commercial enterprise who is managing that as an alternate service delivery organization. This is a big thing to do for government. So again, the level of my work had to be at the highest quality, signed off by the deputy minister. So you need to make sure that whatever this transfer procedure and the governance process around here is at the highest level to make sure that we're completely covered as an organization and not exposed. Okay, continuing on, Articles 51 to 59. Supervisory authority. So this is about governance. Independence is about governance. General conditions and members of the supervisory authority is about governance. These people are the governance organization that provides governance over the regulation and how it's applied within the organization. So it's a very important part. It needs to be recognized that this is about governance around the organization. It needs to be documented, defined, executed as a governance exercise. Competency tasks, competency of lead supervisory authority. This is about governance and human resources. So human resources are going to build the job descriptions. They're going to work with the governance committee to make sure that we have the right competencies of those people who are assigned to these roles. 57 task powers, 58 and 59 activity roles. So tasks are all about procedures and standards. They're about executing, but about not executing in a broad, wide, uncontrolled fashion. We need to have some standards that they need to execute against. The powers and the authority needs to be decided by the governance committee and needs to be articulated in the roles and responsibilities by HR. Activity reports. This is a report up to the governance committee and, of course, could be shared with the regulatory body as well. Again, more analysis here on Chapter 7. Section 1, cooperation. This is about governance. Cooperation between lead supervisory authority and supervisory authorities concerned. This is about governance. Mutual assistance. This is about policy and procedures. So we have an agreement to work with the regulator. We need to have some policy in place and procedures on what that's going to look like. These all need to be defined. We can't just leave this loosey-goosey, as you might say. It needs to be well defined so that we don't have any kind of issues popping up that haven't been considered or addressed or risk reviewed. Mutual assistance, it's about policy and procedures. Joint operations, supervisory authorities, it's about policy and procedures. So we're going to have a pretty substantial policy manual from GDPR. Thank you, GDPR, for that. But it's very important because we want to get this right. It's a very important subject, right? And governance is absolutely, it's at the top of the apex. It's the alpha of the omega. And governance needs to be involved, but it needs to be executed properly and designed properly in order to work. Consistency, this is about governance, consistency mechanisms. These are about setting standards, goals, and having procedures that lead toward that goal. And then any sort of deviation, being able to monitor for that and being able to action it and get things back on course as quickly as possible. Opinion of the board, this is about governance. So the board of governors or directors, the regulatory board may have some comments for us. So we need to take those into the organization and address those. So this is about the governance process, the relationship. The dispute resolution process. So this is about a procedure and some standards that we might set around how we address disputes. Urgency procedure and exchange of information. So these are all about policies and procedures. 68 to 76 articles. These are all about governance. So the European Data Protection Board. This is an external entity that the organization is going to work with. We need to have clear governance around how these relationships work together. And they're going to touch on a number of different topics, including independence of the board, tasks of the board, reports, procedures, chair, tasks of the chair, secretary, confidentiality. Now, normally when I set up the governance committee within the enterprise or the organization for cybersecurity, we have a terms of reference. And in the terms of reference, it defines all of these things. The roles and responsibilities, the inputs, the outputs, who the chair is, how often they meet, all of these types of things are defined in the terms of reference. And Chapter 8, remedies, liabilities, and penalties. So these are definitely a legal area. So this is something that the organization might be exposed on. And as I mentioned before, having the general counsel or having a lawyer for the organization being responsible for GDPR is not good because it obscures their independence of the organization. So for instance, if we had a breach and the lawyer who was responsible for managing the GDPR on a day-to-day basis went to court to represent the organization, the judge could easily say, conflict of interest. You're discussing the work that you do in the organization. Where's the independence, right? So that could be a problem, and that the judge might ask for a different lawyer to represent the organization. So now the types of things that the lawyer will be involved in this case within the GDPR, my opinion only, is the right to lodge a complaint with a supervisory authority. That's something you want to review with legal. Right to effective judicial remedy against the supervisory authority. You definitely want to discuss that with your legal team. Right to effective judicial remedy against a controller or a processor. Again, this is illegal. It's a risk management, but the lawyers help manage the risk of the enterprise or the organization. And that's one of the key skills that you need to have as a lawyer. It's risk management. Representation of data subjects, suspension of proceedings, right to compensation and liability, general conditions of imposing administrative fines and penalties. These are all legal issues in my experience. These are not things that the leader of the cybersecurity team or the privacy team would take on. These are things that your general counselor would take on and help you address. Okay, we're getting near the end. Provisions related to specific processing situations. So Article 85, processing and freedom of expression and information. There needs to be a policy around how this can happen and what are the procedures in order to make it happen. The same with processing and public access to official documents. There needs to be a policy on this, and there needs to be some procedures to back it up. So in the government, we have FOIPA, and we have ARCs and ORCs, which is a procedure on how to access information. We also have the Freedom of Information consideration, which needs policies and procedures around who's authorized to sign off on it, what can you ask for, what can't you ask for, and how do you get it? So a lot of questions need to be answered. Processing of national identification number. This is a very sensitive topic that needs to be addressed carefully. So we need to have a policy around it and procedures. Processing in context of employment. Again, more policy and procedures. Safeguarding of degradations related to the processing and archiving purposes in the public interest, scientific or historical research purposes, or statistical purposes. Again, policies and procedures. We need to define what this is, who's authorized to make decisions about it, and how do we do it? How do we make this happen? Obligation of secrecy, policy and procedures, and existing data protection rules of churches and religious associations. So we need to have policies on how we handle that type of information, and procedures on how we handle it, and policy on what the decision based process is, who's involved in the decision for the organization. And so these are highly sensitive. It's possible that your governance committee could have a lawyer sitting on it in order to help you make these decisions. That might be a good way to do it. Certainly that's something that we've done in the cybersecurity program. I've done before, is I have the CEO and all his top executive teams members as members of the governance committee, and also the legal team to sit in case something pops up, and they can say, oh, wait a minute. Right? So it's a good idea. All right, so I think this is the last. Let me just check here. Oh no, I've got more to go. Okay, sorry. Exercise of the delegation and committee procedure. So these are all about governance. So how do we execute this process? Who's involved in this process? Who are the delegates? And what are the implementation acts that we need to consider? Chapter 11, final provisions. So repeal of Articles 95, 46 and the EC, relationship with the Directive 2002-58. So these are all about governance. These are also tied into the legal registry and how it's defined as a compliance issue for the organization. But these, again, are compliance risks. Relationship with previously concluded agreements, commission reports, review of other union legal acts, and data protection and entry into force and application. So these are all governance items. So again, lots of governance items need to be, a governance book or instruction needs to be created just for GDPR, and then there needs to be some education awareness. Obviously, some people need to be assigned to the governance committee. There needs to be a terms of reference on what they're going to be looking at, including all of the things that we just looked at, which is a lot. I think 35% of the items that we've seen listed here, the articles 1 to 99, 35% of them are about governance. So here's my summary. So if you had one person working on GDPR and they have 1,880 hours in 1 year, the percentage of time that they would spend on each of these items that we just talked about, each of the articles 1 to 99, they spend 1% on the architecture of the protection systems. They'd spend 2% on auditing to make sure that all the processes were working properly. 3% on breach protocol, because this is a very important topic, something that you probably want to test like you would incident response. You need to have a business plan to address some of the items in here. So how are we going to use personal information in our business, and how will it be treated or leveraged? What can happen, what can't happen with it? 5, you need to have a data classification schema, because this drives the level of control that's applied to it. And this is the handoff between compliance and between operations, right? So we talked about, the ERM, the Enterprise Risk Management System, compliance risk versus operational risks. So compliance can help make decisions about what the classifications should be. And there's a number of other stakeholders as well in the organization that need to help make decisions about classifications, because classifications will drive what type of security controls that we put in place, such as encryption. 1% on defined terms, so we need to have a glossary of legal defined terms. It needs to be maintained. 35% on governance, and we talked a lot about governance. So governance is a very important. So the governance people will be looking at the inputs, making decisions. There would be outputs, and then there would be somebody taking those outputs, someone assigned to delivering on those outputs. Human resource plays an important role. We're talking about competencies, for instance, and making sure that the right people, the right bums are in the right seats, for example. Information handling is an important part, 1%. We're going to talk a little bit more about that in a minute. Legal needs to be involved at least 6%, and they might have a seat on the governance committee. This could be included in the 6%. I don't expect the governance committee is going to convene every day. Most of the governance committees that I have implemented, they're on an on-call basis, usually for the first period of time during implementation. Bearing in mind they're all busy people, so you need to have 2 weeks at least notice to schedule them. But on an ongoing basis, that could be extended to, you can meet quarterly or semi-annually. I doubt it would go to annually, because there's probably going to be issues or items that come up that need to be addressed and decisions need to be made. So I would think it'd be quarterly or semi-annually. Risk management is an important part. How we manage the risk around the handling of information and what decisions are made, and how we prioritize what things need to be addressed first. Risk management is an important tool. Everybody needs to be thinking about risk-based decision making. Policy, we talked a lot about policy. It's a big chunk. 6% of the time someone is working in a role based on one resource, they're going to be working on policies. Depending on the size of your organization, your team might be a lot more than one person. You might have 10 people working on GDPR, and maybe 6% of those 10 people will be spent on policy. Procedures, definitely very important. Going to be a lot of training and awareness and communications going on around this, as well as audit, especially during the first period of time, the first 1 to 3 years. I think the audit's going to play a very important role to make sure that people continue to follow whatever procedures it is that you've defined. And if there are opportunities for improvement, because we like to take a quality management approach to everything that we do at the Barnard Institute of Cybersecurity, that's important. If you want to be a center of excellence, you have to think about quality all the time. So there's always opportunities for improvement whenever you execute any of these activities. There should be some kind of a feedback loop, and we should ask ourselves, how can we do this better? If we don't do it out loud, we should think about it and maybe present something, maybe we can do this better. And procedures are definitely one of those key points. Standards as well. Always an opportunity for improvement on standards. We don't just set one level of encryption and say everything's going to be encrypted to AES or WAP2 or what have you. That might evolve, it might change how we handle information, how we transport information, who we share it with. All those types of standards might change over a period of time. So doing lessons learned and always following up on continual improvement, using the audit team to help monitor that would be very useful. So that's 14. And finally 15, the scope. So we talked a lot about scope, especially at the very beginning. This is important because it helps to contain how we apply GDPR, how we maybe implement it. Maybe our scope is small to a limited group until we iron out the program and get it running properly, and then maybe we expand the scope after that. But certainly the scope is something that needs to be defined. The privacy impact assessment should help you with that as you build a registry of personal information holdings in different instances. You're going to be that's going to help define your scope, where you need to go and what you need to tackle will be very important in the scope. And the scope should be part of the business plan as well as your tactical and strategic initiatives that are going on forward. So that's a summary of my analysis. And now I'm going to make some suggestions. And sorry, this is just a summarized list, 1 to 15. Okay, so information protection and governance. It starts with the governance committee. And I mentioned that several of the governance committees that I've set up are usually made up of executives who are responsible for specific lines of business or portfolios. These are busy people. In the terms of reference that we define for them, we also define the fact that they can send a delegate if they cannot attend. However, the delegate must have some decision-making power, or else we're going to make decisions based on a quorum. So we don't stop because somebody can't make the meeting. We try to make everybody available for the meeting for that purpose. That's the important part about governance. The governance committee needs to be made up of people who have responsibility for the risks of their portfolios, the resource assignments, and the budgets around it. So they're the people who can make things happen, and they're the people who need to know about the risks around GDPR and other regulations. That's the governance committee. They need to have a legal registry. This is not always readily available, in my experience. So I work with many lawyers, and I've gone to them and asked them, can you provide a list of the laws and regulations? Most of the time, they're very reluctant to do that for some reason. I'm not sure why. But so we end up building one. It has to be built as part of the cybersecurity program. And certainly, I think it needs to be built in a way that includes any sort of privacy regulations, whether they're GDPR or FOIPA or PIPEDA or PIPA or what have you, Safe Harbor. There's a lot of different regulations out. There's a nice one that was built by the top financial organizations in New York, so it's very good. Legal registry needs to contain 4 different elements. And the governance committee needs to know about these. Governance committee should know what the regulations are that apply to our organization. They need to know what the statutes are that apply to our organization. They're probably already aware of the internal-facing contracts, but they might not be. Internal-facing contracts, I'll give you an example. So if we have a licensed product that we're using, Microsoft, Cisco, or what have you, Oracle, or PeopleSoft, or Salesforce, whatever that product is, we have some obligations to that organization to make sure that we protect their intellectual property. So that's what an internal-facing contract usually talks about, is how we protect the assets that we've licensed from somebody else. External-facing contracts are all about our customers and suppliers and a number of other groups. So this is where flow-down clauses or other types of schedules or articles, might come into play. External-facing, we have obligations to our customers. GDPR is a good example of that. So if our customers have entrusted their personal information to us to perform a certain service or provide a product to them, then we better darn well make sure we protect their information. So it's important to define these. And we also delineate between the 4 because they all have different specific goals that need to be addressed. So the governance committee needs to be aware of that. And the governance committee will help to make decisions. So they won't do the business impact or vulnerability assessments, but somebody who's been assigned the responsibility for cybersecurity or for GDPR will be doing their analysis and presenting the results of their analysis to the governance committee for a decision. This is defined in the terms of reference. This is one of the inputs. So not only will external organizations present things to the governance committee, but more importantly, the person who's been put in charge, needs to be on a daily basis managing the process and bringing these issues to the governance committee to address. And then finally, the governance committee will make a decision on what the risk is. The best situation is that you can quantify the risk in a risk rating. That will help the governance committee to make the decision and prioritize what needs to be addressed. If you do a qualitative approach, not advisable by me for sure, I think it leaves too much opportunity for anomalies to occur in your risk management process that could completely send it sideways or backwards. Policies and procedures will get created as part of the process. So when we identify a risk, how are we going to treat the risk? That's the next question. That's when you present the risk to the governance committee. It's been prioritized. You should also have an action plan. You shouldn't be walking in there asking them what to do. If you do, you probably won't be employed for very long. So you need to come with an action plan. You need to work with the manager who's responsible for those assets. So if there's a manager who's responsible for a particular procedure or a practice that involves personal information or any other type of information that's governed by the organization, then you need to come with an action plan that will help mitigate that risk. So the policies and procedures are part of the risk treatment, perhaps. Maybe that might be part of your recommendation. You might say, well, if we try modifying the policy that exists or creating a new policy to provide direction to employees, this might be a good opportunity to help mitigate that risk. However, if that doesn't work, we might need to have some procedures. So in a lot of cases in my analysis, I've identified the fact that there are places where policies and or procedures are needed or standards. That might be part of our recommendation after we do our GDPR analysis. So the employees need to know about that. There needs to be a communication strategy. And if we want to put skills in their hands so that they can do something about it, then we need to provide awareness training as well. The responsibilities also need to be defined in job descriptions. So if we determine that part of the risk is there's no clarification in the governance between the employees or between the different roles and responsibilities, then we need to work with human resources to make sure that the competencies are built into the job descriptions and then it's articulated and communicated to the managers who are responsible for reviewing these people's work to make sure that they're following the job description and the responsibilities in compliance with GDPR and the other regulations that we have to follow. There's also a very useful technique that I've adopted from the ISO 27000 Information Security Management System approach. And that is, once we've done our risk analysis, we've made recommendations and the governance committee has agreed to implement specific types of controls such as policies or procedures or standards, then we want to create a registry of what's been authorized. And we do this for a very important reason, because this group of people have fiduciary responsibility for the organization. This group of people can be fired, they can go to jail, they can be fined for anything that happens within the organization that is in contravention of the law or the regulations such as GDPR. So we want to make sure that when we agree to the different types of controls that are applied, that we build a registry so that we can use that as an audit tool for external auditors, internal auditors. We can also use it to help repel or address external inquiries. So we may have an external auditor, such as the annual audit that happens for internal financial controls or the CFO certification. They may come in and they may suggest a bunch of new controls. We don't want layers and layers and layers of controls that do the same thing, because that restricts our agility. And it might impair our resilience as well. There's a lot of problems that can happen with too many layers of controls, and it's not optimal to what we do as an organization. So we need to have a registry. We need to have a mechanism on how to review those. So if we do get external reviews from auditors and they have an opinion that we need to implement new controls, then we need to justify that control into place. This will give us an opportunity to review the control to see if we already have a control that's in place that needs to be updated or modified perhaps or optimized, or to see if there truly is a gap that we've missed. So the authorized control registry is very important. In the ISO world, we call it the statement of applicability. And it's part of the submitted documents that we send to the ISO organization when we get certified. Okay, laws. Well, let's talk about laws and legal obligations, because this is, there's so much emphasis on personal information protection and the GDPR and the data protection regulation, PIPA, FOIPA, HIPAA. There's so much emphasis on it that sometimes compliance risk tends to obscure the reality of the entire legal obligation registry. And that's why it's so important to define that registry back there that we talked about, this legal registry, and list these regulations and statutes so that the governance committee has a clear picture on what it is that we should be doing. Now, we're going to talk about that a little bit more. So GDPR is important, without a doubt. But we also have other regulations that overlap. So we have Personal Information Protection, Electronic Documents Act, PIPA. We have Freedom of Information and Protection of Privacy Act, FOIPA. And we have Personal Information Protection Act, PIPA. And we also have recently the California Consumer Privacy Act. So we have a lot of overlap between all these organizations. So remember when we were talking about making a control registry? So this is where it's going to come in handy, right? It's because when we do our review, our privacy impact assessments and our risk assessments, we're going to find out that we have one piece of information, but we have 20 pieces of regulation or laws that are trying to apply control over that and protect it. So we have a lot of overlap. So do we build layer after layer after layer after layer to address each of these? Hopefully not. We want to optimize our control list to make sure that we're focusing all our energy on the right controls that are going to protect the information. So we want to boil it down so that we have a clear set of controls. But privacy regulations and laws are not the only thing that touch on information protection. So we also have cybersecurity laws that overlap. Cybersecurity is a very important subject, and as you know, since President Obama sent out Executive Order 21, and NIST created the cybersecurity framework, it's been a huge emphasis in the U.S. The NIST cybersecurity framework in the last 2 years has been adopted by Canada. It's being used by many other organizations around Europe who trade and provide services to the U.S. So anybody that's being touched, it's that supply chain thing, right, has to follow some kind of cybersecurity law as well as privacy laws. They all overlap. So finding out where they overlap and where they don't is very important. And creating that registry of controls will help you to clarify that. So for instance, cybersecurity laws. We have the EU Cybersecurity Act. We have Homeland Security Act. Federal Information Security Management Act, which is big, which is what gives NIST their authorization to build, the 853-5 and the 800-171 and the NIST cybersecurity framework. So all those frameworks all come from the FISMA Act. Canada's anti-spam legislation, CASL. We have the U.S. Cyber Intelligence Sharing Protection Act. We have many acts. They all overlap. They all try and protect information in some way. A lot of it touches on humans. And for many decades, before cybersecurity and privacy was an issue, we've had lots of other regulations and laws that help protect information. We've had the Health Insurance Probability and Accountability Act. This act and CASL have generated so many fines to commercial organizations. They really are the teeth of information protection. The Gramm-Leach-Bailey Act, the Statement of Service Organizations. I've worked with many organizations who are trying to go IPO on the New York Stock Exchange, for instance, or the Toronto Stock Exchange. They can't get there until they've satisfied all the requirements to build a proper cybersecurity program. And I know that the GDPR will benefit from a lot of that work, but there needs to be clear delineation between who's responsible for which part, compliance versus operational risk. So a lot of these things here in cybersecurity land and within the financial laws and regulations touch on operational risk. Most recently, we had the New York Financial Group, the top financial organizations, commercial organizations in New York, got together and created the Cybersecurity Regulation 23, known as the 23 NYCRR 500. This is one of the best pieces of work that I've seen. I'm really impressed. In fact, not to play down the accountants, but coming from the financial world and working mostly in the financial world myself, this is one of the best, if not the best, that I've seen so far coming from this group, from this industry. Very good. There's a statement of attestation standards, engagements for 18, and also the international standards on attestation. So these are very, very important because these are the ones that I was talking to before, where we have an annual CFO certification by external auditors, and they might try and impose new controls in the organization. So it's important to have a clear registry of controls that you apply to your organization, understand where they're at, and being able to provide evidence, support them. Also be able to provide evidence that the governance committee has reviewed them and that decisions have been made around what type of risk we're going to accept, what we're not going to accept, what we're treating, and also to limit the confusion. There's so much confusion about what we need to do and what we don't need to do because all of these acts overlap each other. And then there's, of course, the payment card industry. So several of these acts are actually based on ISO 27001, a lot of them, because ISO 27001 was created in 95 by the UK government when they couldn't get their supply chain to follow the government's security standards. So they created the standard. It was later adopted 10 years later by the ISO organization, who is trying to harmonize business processes around the globe. The ISO 27001 was born. And a lot of these will map into that framework. Some of them go beyond it. Some of them take different angles to it, but generally that's the backbone for a lot of these regulations that you see. So we don't just have privacy laws to worry about, but we have cybersecurity, we have financial laws, and there's many, many more. This is just a small list. I wanted to give you an example just for the discussion purposes. Okay, decision points. So what are the decision points around handling personally identifiable information? You know, people make decisions about creating, securing, sharing, auditing, adding, using, change, archiving information, interfacing the information with other systems, disclosing information to maybe third parties or other groups within the organization, consolidating the information, oh, bad, taking personal information from different sources and putting it into one database. Whoa, as a privacy officer, that's something that's just, you're like, wow. Because you don't have, a lot of times you have a specific purpose for that personal information to be used, and now all of a sudden you have people trying to merge it and create a new purpose, and that creates problems. Where do we migrate the data to? Does it get recycled? Can it be reused? Not anymore. Right now we have to ask for permission to use it over and over again. And also, if you're reusing it for another purpose, you need to have a different type of request. And then, of course, deleting it. When do you get rid of it? How can you get rid of it? Does there need to be any sort of records? So this is what I call the information handler circle of trust. So making decisions around this information, so important. So the green circle is all about information governance and accountability. So we talked about the governance committee, making sure that they understand what information assets we have under our care and how we protect them and all the different regulations that apply. Very important. Governance committee plays a very important role. They have a lot of responsibility. So much information within most enterprises. Some of it is purely focused on the enterprise and what its function is and what it does, its mission. But some of it has been organically grown. And a lot of it, personal information that was never registered, if you like, before. So you look at banks and credit unions and insurance companies and the volume of information that they've been collecting. Legal firms, the type of sensitive information that they have in files about serious legal issues of their customers. There's lots of personal information, health authorities. There's so much of it that's been gathered and organically grown and shared, and sometimes shared inappropriately and unauthorized, illegally. So it's so governance is important. How we manage it, we got to manage it with our risk management hats on. We got to think about it in terms of risk to the organization. And we got to abstain from doing some of their legacy practices. So organizations must refrain from using unlawful, for instance, information sharing agreements. This is an agreement that different ministries within the government signed many decades ago, before privacy was ever a concern. But they agreed that they would share personal information between ministries. So obviously each ministry has their own purpose. They should be asking for permission to use it for their purpose. But in a lot of cases, they have been sharing it without asking for permission. So this is something that's completely, in my opinion, illegal. That should be cleaned up, but it's going on today. Other clandestine methods to gather citizens' information. So we heard recently about a realty company who had a billboard posted in a mall, and when people went up to look at it and touch different pictures and look at different houses that for sale or properties, it was taking pictures of them. It didn't ask for permission. It just did that, right? So we have to avoid those types of things. Transparency and truth are the cornerstones of all healthy relationships. And so I think that's something that we need to work on. We need to trust each other, but we need to provide transparency of what we're doing so that we can trust each other. Interested parties include external requests for information. So a lot of times you hear about law enforcement asking Google or Facebook for information. They work closely together for a good reason, but it needs to be brought out why we do that, right? Sorry, my Google Assistant is talking to me. And finally, on the circle of trust, flow down clauses. So supply chain was identified. It's definitely been highlighted by the NIST cybersecurity framework as a big issue. We're seeing it today. We have an election going on with the U.S. presidency, and we're seeing a supply chain problem with the type of business type of software that's being used and who's counting the votes, and that sort of stuff is happening. Well, that's just an example of how a supply chain can break down. If you attend my NIST cybersecurity course, I spend a lot of time talking about supply chains and how to evaluate supply chains. External suppliers, including third parties and vendors who provide products, they need to follow the rules. If they're an alternative service delivery organization, so they handle personal information that you've collected, there needs to be some clear rules and obligations, and they need to follow the law, the GDPR regulations, as well as all the other laws that we've listed that you might not even have considered yet. And there needs to be, oh, by the way, exit clauses. And that's one of the big things I see missing in contracts is what do we do when the relationship breaks down with our third party? How do we remove ourselves from that relationship? And do they have any rights about keeping any of our information, including our customer information? So we need to be very clear on the fact of how that's going to be handled and executed, and work with our lawyers, of course, on making sure that our agreements and contracts include things like exit clauses and flow down clauses. So here's some workflows for daily operations. So for instance, you have an employee who gets a piece of information. They want to know what do they have. They want to know who's authorized to it. They need to apply security controls, and then they need to share it or publish it or do something with it. So during this process, we're going to look at validating the request, classifying the material, controlling the distribution, making clear markings on what the classification is, and archiving a master copy. So this is the information handling decision point workflow for daily operations. Okay, so first of all, if the employee gets a piece of personal information, and we would have training and awareness around this, so we don't walk through the workflow necessarily on a day-to-day basis, but we teach employees how to do this, and then they go ahead and they do it. So if they have a question about what type of information I have, they may need to ask for clarification. So they may ask the designated data protection officer or the data owner or the custodian or whatever you might call them in your organization. So they clarify that. Who is authorized to it? Certainly the data custodian, they should know who's authorized to access their information because they were part of the process to approve that. They might also ask their manager, who is authorized to this? Because generally employees might change move around, but managers tend to stay for a little while. They might also ask the manager, who do I publish it to? Because you also need to make a record of who you send this information to, and you can't just hit the enter key and send it without going through some due diligence to make sure. And then, of course, keeping a record in case there's some follow-up action. There's some questions about who you share information with by the auditor. You need to have records. It could be electronic. It could be generated automatically when you send the information. That depends on your process. Excuse me. Also, if you have an information security privacy officer or a CISO or a data protection officer or a chief cybersecurity officer, you may want to verify what the classification is. So, excuse me. So if I know what type of information I have, then I have a particular type of classification, which drives a particular type of security control that needs to be applied. So once we find out who is authorized and we know what type it is, then we can apply the controls. And then we can share that information or not, reject it. So that's workflow, daily operations. This is for classification changes, workflow. So we initiate, execute control. So let me explain. So the information security and privacy officer has to maintain a classification standard. Okay, so on the classification standard, we're going to review the distribution to make sure it's up to date. We're going to review ownership to make sure that we have the right owners or custodians assigned. We're going to review the security standards, and we're going to review the internal audit process. So the designated information owner gets consulted by the information security and privacy officer about the ownership. They might also review the distribution with them to make sure that they have it right. They're also going to discuss with subject matter experts what the standards are for the classification. And that'll get a little bit clearer in the next few slides. So the reason why subject matter experts are involved is because a lot of times they're responsible for the infrastructure, the endpoint protection that we talked about earlier, and all the other layers of security architecture that need to be addressed. So they need to help set standards around that. We may have some built-in limitations based on perhaps some legacy applications or infrastructure that we're working with on upgrading. So it's important that we apply standards that can be used. We don't want to set a standard too high that we can't comply with, because if we do, then we have a problem. Because when we get an audit, they're going to discover we're not complying with it, and then we're going to have an explanation that needs to be made to an external party and maybe to the board of directors why we're not following it. Now, if you have a proper, there's another angle to this too. If you have a proper risk management methodology, the type of methodology that I implement, it has policies, procedures, standards. It has risk registry, risk treatment plan. It also has exception or exclusion documents. So sometimes, for instance, during mergers and acquisitions, we don't know what the other organization's security framework is, or if it has gaps we need to close. Perhaps we've done an assessment. We might write an exclusion, and this is a good document to have approved by the governance committee so that when an auditor reviews our infrastructure, we can provide evidence that we are aware that there was a gap and that we have a plan on how to close it, so that the exclusion is time bound. There's a certain period of time that the organization has to get compliant. So that's important. That's part of the risk management process. So that's another angle to look at here as we take a risk-based kind of approach to this. Now, the governance committee needs to know about the changes to any classification. Do they actually approve changes to classification? It depends on your organization. They may or may not. They may leave it to the person who's in charge of the cybersecurity program to make those decisions, or to work with the appropriate people, such as subject matter experts and designated custodians, in order to come up with the best plan on how to set classifications. But they definitely need to be aware of it. They need to be aware of what it is, what risk it is that we're mitigating with those. So decision points around workflow and around role-based access control. So we have a designated manager who's initiating. They're going to consult some people, and then they're going to execute and authorize a process. Okay. So what we're going to accomplish here in this decision point workflow for RBAC is we're going to decide where the access control, how it's designed, what's the spooled output look like, how is information transmitted, processed, and stored. This is very important. So we're going to talk to human resources about updating job descriptions, first of all, to make sure that the roles and responsibilities are defined clearly. From the job posting to the time we hire somebody to the time that the manager who hires them is responsible for their activity, the job description needs to be perfect, right? It needs to be as close to perfect as possible. A lot of times my experience has been that the job description actually doesn't take any consideration for access control rights or rights to information. So that's something that's kind of new that needs to be built in to the job description in order to make sure that we have clear delineation, because it's very hard for the people who are responsible for setting access control or establishing identity and access management for new employees to guess at what the employee needs to have access to. And when that happens, we set up a situation where they say, well, that person's going to work for the X manager, and they're going to be doing the job of Y employee that reports to X manager. So let's just copy their profile and rename it with their name. And now we have a new account, but it's a clone of the previous employee. And there's a problem with this, because the problem is that we might, first of all, inherit authorities or rights that are not assigned to that employee, because maybe Y employee has been with the company for 10 years or 15 or 20 years, and they, over that time, they've accumulated their roles and responsibility have grown, right? So they started out with this original job description, but they're doing a whole bunch of, at the bottom of the job description where it says other duties. So they've been doing a lot of other duties, and it's grown. So now we've just given a brand new employee access to all those other duties, which might not be appropriate. So that's very bad. So we need to work with human resources and the hiring manager to make sure that the job description actually defines what it is the employee should have access to. This is a key part of role-based access control. Once we make that decision, then of course, and it's approved, then the human resource needs to communicate it to the employees. The information security privacy officer, or the data protection officer, or the CISO, or the chief cybersecurity officer, whoever this person is that's responsible, needs to be consulted on the architecture of the security and the protection of personal information. They need to be reviewed, the access control, the security standards with that person. And they also need to create any new standards that might need to be applied in this particular situation. And of course, system engineers are the experts at the infrastructure level, at the application level, the information level, who are the people who are going to help establish the controls that we're talking about implementing in order to protect that information. So that's 3 workflows. I hope that was helpful for you. The design is kind of like this. So we have employees. Let's say we have these 5 employees. We have Jill, Bill, May, Ken, and Joe. Okay? Each employee has a different job description because they have different roles and responsibilities. Okay? These roles and responsibilities are based on risk. So different job descriptions, different roles and responsibilities provide access to different network services, different data assets or information assets, different levels of control within the organization, maybe based on a risk tier like this. So maybe some of the information is considered to be extremely risky. So we need to have a higher level of control for job description 1. Maybe job description 2 is close to a high level. Maybe it's secret and not top secret, for instance. And but maybe it needs to have some clear delineation. So we talked about zero trust and limiting authorities least authority as concepts within information security and cybersecurity. And this is how these get applied into the architecture of the processes through a simple approach like role-based access control. And so on and so forth. So you may have lower level type of information. You might have information that's available generally publicly to everybody. So, a low level person providing maybe basic services to the organization might have a general job description. Doesn't give them access to anything that's secret or top secret or restricted. It just gives them access to general business information, network services such as printers that print general type of information, and not confidential information. So that type of approach. So this is based on risk. Now in the RBAC world, we might have defined the risk. We understand the job description. And now we're going to create a group profile that grants access. So we don't want to do it on a name-by-name account basis because, as I mentioned before, sometimes when you clone a profile, you get inherited authorities and rights. That's not a good thing for the organization. It can lead to a breach, in fact. So, or unauthorized disclosure. So we create group profiles. Group profile 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay? Each of them has a different authorization level. They have different network services. They have different access to different types of data on the environment and different authorities generally. So this is how we begin to create a role-based access control design. And finally, as I mentioned before, they may have access to different types of information. So Jill has job description 1. Job description 1 means that she is executive assistant. She works for the CEO, or she works for our chief legal officer or chief privacy officer. They have extreme access or extreme access to extremely risky information. And so they get a group profile 1, and it provides that restricted access. So this is how role-based access control works. Hope that was clear. If you have any questions, of course, after the presentation, you can always email me. Now, each of the classifications, this is based on a 4-scale classification system. So we have public, operational, confidential, and restricted. We have, these are the different, so remember the circle of trust around the decision points in information handling? So each of the decisions that are made relate back to probably some kind of activity and a standard that gets applied. So if you have public access to information, a lot of the restrictions are removed. Okay. However, if you have operational access level, then you might see some things trickling in here, like you need authority, you need the asset owner or the data protection officer to grant you access. You might need to use encryption when you're using it on storages or removable data. You might need to, so here it's optional, but here's mandatory. So this is operational data. Operational data is generally something that we can share with people that we work with who are external. So for instance, an auditor or a third party who has questions about our environment or our security, there may be something that we can share that's been sanitized somewhat, and that's easy to share. So for instance, policies don't generally include anything like a security standard that says the level of encryption we use or the type of structure of our passwords or anything that could be useful to a hacker. Generally, a policy says that you must do this, right, in order to mitigate risk. So policies are generally operational in nature and something that you can share with people. Confidential information, a little bit different. Okay, so confidential, we need to run our business, but might not be allowed to be shared with an external party. So we have a number of different levels of security controls that we apply in this. These are all baked into the organization, but the purpose of information handling is so that we have a mechanism of instructing employees, especially the front office employees that might not understand the technical aspects, but they need to know what needs to be applied if they're handling a particular type of information. And this could be associated, again, with their RBAC, with their roles and responsibility or their job description. And then restricted. So we have, again, a number of different levels. This is the highest level of control. So you can see physical removal not advised, network access VLAN. We talked about that earlier in the security architecture. We talked about encryption and physical access control. So we have some restricted control. So the information may be contained in a locked room where they don't have access to, or they might have access to and nobody else does. The data needs to be encrypted. Permission of the owner is advised for any copying of the information. So in some environments I've seen where they have deployed thin clients with no USBs. In fact, with EDS at Vic Park, when we were handling the governance information, we had a laboratory, and because we have such restricted privacy legislation here, very comparable to GDPR, people weren't allowed to, when they were working on systems or applications or infrastructure, they went into the lab. They were not allowed to carry any USBs. They had to be accompanied. The devices that were in the lab didn't have any CD-ROMs or infrared ports, or they didn't have any USB ports. So they couldn't copy any information and take it with them. They could only just go in there and work on the computer in the lab, and that was it. And I've also seen thin clients deployed in a similar manner, because thin clients don't have any ports. They don't actually contain any information. They always refresh from the server. So there's a total segregation on the network, and the information is held back from the device, so it can't be copied. Again, transmission over the internet, FTP, email, or wireless is all encrypted. The standard would be set probably at AES2 or WPA2. Disposal, you need to use a shredding box. Third-party external disclosure, you need a contract, SLAs, NDAs. You need those flow-down clauses. Electronic media, you need to have release date plus classification, external and internal labels, so you need to write on it. And some organizations, they might say, we don't want people to know what classification is, so don't write it. So that could be possible. Hard copy labeling, each page of loose sheets, front and back covers. If you're in an organization, I know, like for instance at IBM, we had restricted printing rooms based on classifications, but we always had to, when we printed documents, there always had to be a blank front page that said the classification level. So everybody was fully aware when they pick up a document to read it, they can see it's classified as restricted. They know what their authorization is. If it's not restricted, then they should not be touching that document. Physical mail handling, access to a specific person, but label only on the inside of the envelope. So you might have a blank envelope on the outside that says it's going to Office X, Department Y, but once you open that envelope, it actually has the name of the person, so the information is still protected inside the next envelope, the second envelope, not exposed until it reaches the person that it's supposed to go to. Tracking, of course, we track almost everything we send out. We have insurance couriers, we have regular couriers, UPS, FedEx. Human resources needs to be able to train people and make sure that non-disclosure agreements, maybe non-competition agreements, are signed in the employment agreement. Remote access, we have a number of layers that we might apply: VPN, SSL, TAXIS, IPsec. We didn't mention these. Some of these are protocols more than technology. That's not mentioned in the security architecture, but certainly could be applied. Desktops, UBS flash drives, infrared ports, and Bluetooth are restricted. And laptops, restricted USB, DVD, IR, infrared ports. So those are classification schemas. And this presentation is taking a little while, so I hope that you're all enjoying it and getting some value out of this. Let's talk about the flow downs now. So we're getting close to the end. Country of origin. So customer, legal obligations, statutes, regulations, and contracts. So customer of origin is mentioned a lot in GDPR. This is important because where does the information come from? What person? What are the local laws that we have to apply? So we need to understand what their obligations are, the legal obligations, with regards to statutes, regulations, and contracts. And then we need to combine that with what our obligations are as an organization. So where are we located and what are we obligated to follow? And then we need to articulate that into our flow down clauses. And again, the flow down clause is really like taking the actual legal clause from the agreement, from the statute or regulation, and incorporating that into an article or a schedule and writing flow down, and then making it part of the contract. So what we do by doing this is the flow down might be applicable to an organization in the supply chain that's not in the country of origin, or it's not in the organization's legal region, okay? But they're in another part of the world. So the laws and the statutes and regulations that apply in the country of origin or in the organization's region might not apply to them, okay? So this has been going on for a long time. So for instance, if we send data to India, the laws of the US or Canada may not apply there. And if we collect that data from European citizens, their laws might not apply there either. So how do we fix this problem? Well, it's simple. Flow down clauses. So you write the legal obligations from the European Union for GDPR. You write the legal obligations from Canada to the US into an article. You put it into the master services agreement with the organization that's in India or New Zealand or wherever it might be, okay? And now all of a sudden it becomes a contractual obligation, which is different, and but it has to be enforced because as part of the contract. So now we've imposed the laws of our land in the contract on that service provider in the contract. So that's how you do this. That's why flow down clauses are so important, right? Okay, so we're really getting close to the end now. This is the GDPR Enterprise Management System. So it's also the Cybersecurity Management System. So these are the high-level procedures, processes, standards that go on in a management system that help drive all the details that we've just reviewed and discussed. So you need to have a governance process. We talked about the governance committee. You need to have a risk management methodology and a risk management process. That's the decision. That's how we make decisions, how we prioritize where our biggest exposures are so that we can treat those. We need to have continual improvement. So this is the quality management approach. We need to have some way of gathering feedback from procedures, making sure that as we go forward that we're always constantly improving, making these better and better, hardening our systems, making sure they're more secure, making sure our procedures are more accurate, they're clearer for people to understand, making sure that we have a communication strategy in place, and then we have awareness training going on. So the difference, of course, some people get these confused, but communication is about raising people's awareness about a topic, such as GDPR, so personal information, or cybersecurity. So we want to take their awareness level from very low, assuming that they don't know about it, they're not interested in it, and we want to gradually rise it, lift it up inside of their conscious mind so that they are constantly thinking about it, not just at work, maybe in their general life. So a communication strategy is designed to raise that awareness up in order to make it help the employee to make better decisions when they come into contact with personal information or organizational information. So it's communication strategy is something that goes on an annual basis. So you have a strategy, you lay it down, you might have communication pieces, you might have different channels that you use. It's kind of like an internal marketing process. And then you continually go through this process on an annual basis. You revise it every year, maybe do a different subjects, talk about the governance committee, what you're planning on doing, get their approval on it. Awareness training puts the skills in hands. So communication doesn't always put skills, but it puts ideas in people's minds. Awareness training actually gives people skills. So if you want people to learn how to encrypt email before they send it out or attachments, you need to teach them how to do that. You need to show them what equipment to use, what technology to use. You need to show them how to click the right button in their email box. Also, you need to teach them about information handling and how to classify information. What does operational information look like? So how can they recognize it? What does unclassified information look like? What does restricted information look like? And what are they supposed to do with it? So this is not part of the communication. The communication might say, we have a classification schema you should follow, right? We have a policy on that. So that's, here's where you find it. But the awareness training is where you actually put them through the paces. And you might use gamification or some other type of technique. You have to use multiple channels. You always have to use different approaches in order to get the information through, in order to transfer that knowledge. So there is a distinct difference between the two. Now, throughout the process of any type of management system, you need to have evidence to back it up always, okay? You're going to get inquiries. In the past, sometimes we get an inquiry, it takes us 2 weeks to respond, maybe a month, right? But in a real-time cybersecurity GDPR management system, you need to respond quicker. The timelines are short. By delaying the response, it makes it look like you're fabricating stuff, to be honest with you. Makes it look like you're trying to make it up, make sure that we're telling the right story. But in a management system, you already have the story. Okay, you know how you manage that information. You have the processes, policies, and procedures in place. Okay, all you need to do is make sure that you collect evidence of it being used. So controlling key documentation, making sure it's accurate, reviewed once a year, making sure lessons learned are built into it, making sure that you're keeping records of activities such as change management or changes to the classification schema or changes to or investigations, keeping records of those, etc. Now on the outside here, this is the final process that needs to happen. So unfortunately, all of the acts that we looked at, including GDPR, all the privacy regs and laws, financial and cybersecurity, mostly cybersecurity, but there's one cybersecurity that actually includes this part, and that's the role of internal audit. Internal audit traditionally has always been extremely valuable to all organizations, and the reason why it's been valuable is because the internal auditor, much like an enterprise architect, knows all about the organization and how it operates and functions. And the internal auditor is the person that you can go to and shouldn't be afraid of and ask them. Say, we're thinking of doing this. What are your thoughts on that? Because they can tell you about the organization, how it runs. They can tell you where the pitfalls are or the risks, and they can help guide you that way. They can't actually provide agreement or authorization to do it because that's not their role, because they provide arm's length monitoring role. Pardon me. And so you can talk to them about that. So internal audit is a key role. External audit can also be important. So again, if you're doing ISO certification, you need to have an external party come in and verify what it is that you're doing. Make sure that it's running properly. So that is the management system. It has several different functions. We talked about it way back, if you remember at the beginning, when we talked about security architecture. So governance, risk management, incident management, continual improvement, strategic communications, awareness training, internal, external audit, record and documentation administration. Now some people might say, well, where's GDPR in here? Well, if you remember, GDPR is part of the enterprise risk management framework. It falls under compliance. And if you're dealing with risk management, you can easily incorporate compliance checking within risk management. You can see if people are following compliance with the law or the regulations by doing an internal external audit, because you have the list of controls in the registry and you can verify that how the information handling practices are working or how some of the policies and standards and procedures are working to make sure that they're compliant with the law. That's it. Okay, so shadow cybersecurity versus GDPR compliance. Unfortunately, this is what we're seeing is there's a lot of enterprise resource management confusion going on because people don't realize that GDPR is a regulation and we must comply with it. It's not meant to implement a brand new set of controls or procedures or analysts that do cybersecurity work. It's meant to work cooperatively within the enterprise with the information protection people. So we need to clear up that confusion. ERM Okay, within the ERM framework, GDPR falls under compliance risk, and cybersecurity and information protection falls under operational risk. We don't want to duplicate expenses. We don't want to create contention for resources or budgets. I think that's a bad move. I've seen some organizations where the privacy group drives the information protection group requirements. And I do think that that is a problem. I think their shareholders, their stakeholders, if you like, not shareholders, but stakeholders in the organization, they both play a role, an important role. Is one more important than the other? Not really. We need to address compliance risk, but we also, in order for compliance risk to actually happen, you need to have cybersecurity operations or information protection functioning. So I would say compliance risk is really dependent on information protection, but it shouldn't be doing the role of information protection. It should be providing governance over it or acting as a stakeholder. Silo-focused programs always fail. They failed for the last 50 years since IT became a profession. And sooner or later they get broken down. And you just need someone smart enough to come along and figure out how to do that, right? Silo-focused, having GDPR or privacy running over here by itself, creating its own infrastructure and its own budgets and its own IT team is going to end up in failure. And because they're going to be running beside the people who actually know what needs to happen. So you looked at the security architecture. I showed it to you, 10 layers at the beginning. If you have people in GDPR doing that same work, that's going to create problems within the organization. Eventually, there's going to be a lot of contention going on and maybe some bad feelings as well. So silo focus is not a good idea, so I would never recommend going down that path. Multiple sources of truth also create problems. So who knows how information is being protected? Who can show how the data flows are running within the organization? Who's the best people to be doing this work, right? Customer experience will be lower. If somebody makes an inquiry about, the right to be forgotten, should they talk to a data protection officer? Absolutely. Yeah. Should the data protection officer be doing the work to make sure that that's removed from the system? No, not a chance. They need to coordinate and collaborate with the information protection people, the cybersecurity people, in order to make sure that that's happening. Because if they don't, the customer's not going to be happy because it's not going to get done properly, right? The records won't be removed properly. They'll probably continue to get emails or spam or what have you. Or physical mail, if there's not a proper delineation. And the reason why the proper delineation is so important is to hold people accountable for what it is that they do. Because if you have information protection people over here providing cybersecurity and trying to safeguard the organization's information, they need to be accountable for that. So when that fails, they need to be held accountable for it. But if they think that the privacy people are over here doing that job, making sure that that information is, the privacy people are going to be really frustrated because they don't really have the competencies that the information protection people have. So they need to be, the privacy people need to be definitely held accountable for compliance with GDPR, but they need to understand that they're dependent on the information protection people to deliver that. And they shouldn't be trying to duplicate that work. So there needs to be some clear delineation. Roles and responsibilities need to be defined. Weak governance with no segregation of duties will lead to problems. And eventually it'll be raised up to the board of directors or the governance committee to be addressed. So it's better if you're designing a program to design it properly at the beginning. Conflicts of interest. General counsel cannot defend their own work in court. I mentioned this earlier. So putting GDPR under the responsibility of a lawyer might seem like a great idea because it seems very complicated. I think the lawyer is best positioned as a consultant, an internal consultant. They're a resource. They're the highest level of risk management in the organization, in fact, because they protect the organization from all the exposures. And there's many that can drag down a company. GDPR is just one of them, but there's lots of others. So, but putting them in an operational role to be responsible for GDPR is going to get them kicked out of court because they won't be able to defend a breach. You'll have to use external counsel or someone else to defend your organization against the breach. And legal counsel is probably not going to be best positioned to understand how information protection works. They know what needs to be done, so they're definitely a stakeholder in the process. And they should be consulted. They should be on the governance committee, in my opinion. But they shouldn't be responsible for the operational role of making sure that information is protected, to making sure that AES is implemented or WPA2 or, there needs to be a segregation of duties and needs to be clear governance around this process. And overall, generally a reduction of effectiveness. So if there's too much confusion around enterprise resource risk management, who does operational risks, who deals with those, who deals with compliance risks, as well as hazard risks or financial risks. Imagine the accountants trying to take on something like AES implementation and making sure that's working effectively. That's probably not the best suited. They probably don't want to do that, actually. So they'd rather do accounting and have information protection people, cybersecurity people take care of the controls around the organization. Again, such as the ones listed in the architecture layers 1 to 10. So I think you need to think about how you're going to implement your GDPR and how it works with cybersecurity. And you definitely don't want to create a shadow organization that's just going to create more confusion within your organization. All right. So, conclusion, in my opinion, it's Mark Bernard from the Bernard Institute of Cybersecurity with over 30 years of experience reporting to some very senior people throughout my career. And my opinion is the most cost-effective, efficient strategy to address GDPR compliance is to map it to the ERM. And I think this also works for cybersecurity too, because cybersecurity is also kind of confused about what their responsibility is and how they map it to ERM. ERM is how we speak to the executives and the board of directors and represent the risk to the organization and the exposure. And if we can't speak in that language, then they're not going to understand what we're saying. Okay? On a day-to-day basis, handling PII in conjunction with cybersecurity and financial information is going to be the best approach, the most effective, efficient approach. I showed you the regulations and the statutes. I showed you how they lined up. Perhaps you weren't aware that there are so many, and that's just a short list. I know in some of the organizations I work with, I've listed up to 60, 70 different regulations and statutes alone, and not talking about contractual obligations. There's a lot to consider. The lawyers probably aren't going to give you a list because there are so many, and they don't want to find out later that they missed one. So that's probably really why they don't want to make a list. It's because there are so many that overlap, and a lot of overlap with information protection, including personal information. So I think this is the best approach. This is what I would suggest, is to map it to the ERM and see how your program shakes out underneath that and supports the ERM. Next steps, I recommend that you find a competent professional who's experienced with privacy and security, of course. I think that you need to conduct a privacy impact assessment to find out what your instances of personal and identifiable information and how they map to your organization. You need to do some data flow mapping, track and map those instances, find out where that data goes. Some organizations I worked with, they have a very clear map. In others, there's as many as 23 hops before a piece of data, a packet, gets outside of the organization. So imagine as a GDPR professional trying to assure compliance with GDPR, not understanding the infrastructure and how the technology works. Do you think that you can map a packet of personal identifiable information that's hopped between 23 different devices within the organization before it goes out or comes in? Good luck. So you need to do the mapping. You need to conduct a threat risk assessment for sure. You need to find out where your exposures are, where your vulnerabilities are. You need to take corrective and preventive actions and work with the governance committee and the manager who's been assigned responsibility, who's a designated data protection officer, perhaps. You need to present it to the governance committee, as I mentioned, for approval. You need to monitor the approved risk treatment plans until they're successfully completed. You need to report the status to the governance committee on the completion of these. And if you have any questions and you need answers rather, please contact me at the Barnard Institute for Cybersecurity. You can also find me on LinkedIn. I'm generally available. I want to thank you for your time and hope that you have a great day and enjoyed this rather long presentation, but hopefully it was a valuable one for you. Have a great day. God bless you.